She stepped off that train with silk gloves, a borrowed suitcase, and a letter full of lies. And the man waiting for her was no different. He'd promised a home. She'd promised a life she'd never lived. Two strangers, two frauds, one frozen wilderness that didn't care about either of them. What happened next wasn't a love story, not at first. First, it was a war. Against the cold. Against pride. Against every version of themselves they'd invented just to survive. This is the story of how two people built something real out of nothing but desperation and dirt. If you're watching this right now, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. You won't regret it. The train had been moving for 3 days before Eleanor Whitmore finally stopped pretending she wasn't terrified. For the first 2 days, she'd kept her back straight and her expression composed, the way her mother had taught her before the money ran out, before the house on Beacon Street was sold off piece by piece, before Eleanor found herself sleeping in her cousin Harriet's sewing room on a cot that creaked every time she breathed. Composure was the last dignity she had left, and she'd worn it like armor through the Boston station, through the first night rattling across upstate New York, through Ohio's flat gray fields and the long, cold stretch of Indiana. But by the third morning, somewhere in the middle of a country so vast it made her feel genuinely, physically small, Eleanor gave up the performance. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and watched the world outside turn into something she didn't recognize. Gone were the brick storefronts and elm trees of Boston. Gone were the church steeples and the familiar geometry of a city that had been built for people like her. People who wore good shoes and attended proper dinners and knew exactly what fork to use at a formal table. Out here, the land just went. It stretched in every direction without apology, without boundaries, without any sign that it had ever cared about the people trying to survive on top of it. Flat grasslands gave way to rolling hills that gave way to something starker and harder, something with edges. The sky was enormous and pale, and the color of old pewter. Eleanor's reflection stared back at her from the glass. 26 years old, brown hair pinned up with 3 pins that kept sliding out. A traveling dress that had been fashionable 2 seasons ago and was now just a reminder of a life that no longer existed. Dark circles under eyes that hadn't slept properly in weeks. She looked, she thought, exactly like what she was, a woman running out of options. In her lap sat the letter. She'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She smoothed it open again now, not because she needed to read the words, she'd memorized every line, but because holding it felt like holding something solid in a world that had become entirely unstable. Dear Miss Whitmore, my name is Wade Mercer. I am a rancher in the Gallatin Valley of Montana Territory, approximately 40 miles south of the town of Bozeman. I have owned and operated my property for 11 years and have built it into a productive and comfortable homestead. The main house is sturdy, well insulated against winter weather, and contains 4 rooms. I employ 2 ranch hands and maintain a working cattle and dairy operation. I am 34 years of age, in good health, and of serious and reliable character. I am seeking a wife who is capable of managing a household and who understands the demands of frontier life. I am not a man who requires much in the way of social company, but I believe a ranch is better run as a partnership. If you are willing, I would be glad to receive your correspondence. Respectfully, Wade Mercer. Eleanor folded the letter and pressed it flat against her knee. She had written back, of course. She had composed her own letter with the same careful attention one would give to a legal document, which was essentially what it was. She had described herself as experienced in household management, knowledgeable about food preservation and cooking, adaptable to rural conditions, and eager for the honest work of frontier life, all of which was completely, thoroughly false. Eleanor's household management experience consisted of being raised in a wealthy Boston household where servants did the actual work. Her cooking knowledge extended as far as knowing which kitchen to walk into and which woman to ask. She had spent exactly 1 week at a cousin's farm in Vermont when she was 12 years old, had spent most of it reading in the hayloft, and had left with hay in her hair and a deep personal conviction that rural life was something other people did. She was not adaptable. She was terrified of large animals. And the most honest work she had done in the past year was helping Harriet hem curtains, which she had done badly and had been told so repeatedly. But Harriet's husband had started making remarks at the dinner table. The kind of remarks that weren't quite accusations, but sat in the air like accusations anyway. Another mouth. Another set of shoes wearing out the carpet. Another year of charity dressed up as family obligation. Harriet had stopped defending her. Eleanor had started eating less, taking up less space, shrinking herself down to something that might eventually become invisible. And then she had found the advertisement. It had been tucked in the back of the Boston Courier between a notice for a new millinery shop and a legal announcement she hadn't bothered to read. Matrimonial Bureau of the Western Territories, connecting women of character with honest men of industry in the frontier West. It was exactly the kind of advertisement that sensible women were supposed to look at and look away from. Exactly the kind of thing that respectable Boston women discussed in hushed, pitying tones when talking about the poor creatures who answered such things. Eleanor had torn it out and kept it in her coat pocket for 2 weeks before she wrote the letter. She was not under any illusions that what she was doing was dignified. She understood that she was, in the plainest terms, selling herself. Or rather, she was selling a version of herself that she hadn't yet become and wasn't certain she ever would. It was the frontier equivalent of signing a contract for a job you didn't know how to do and hoping to learn before anyone noticed. She tucked the letter back into her bag and straightened up in her seat. Outside the window, a hawk was circling something in a field that seemed to go on forever. 4 rooms, she thought, sturdy walls, a real home. She tried to hold on to that. She tried very hard. Wade Mercer was standing at the Bozeman station at 2 in the afternoon, and he was already in a bad mood before the train arrived. He'd ridden in from the ranch that morning, nearly 4 hours on horseback through late October cold that had gotten into his bones before he was halfway to town. His second ranch hand, a kid named Pete, who was 19 and generally useless, had managed to leave the barn gate unlatched 2 nights ago, and 3 of Wade's cattle had wandered into the Kellerman property next door and eaten half of old Roy Kellerman's hay supply. Wade had spent the previous day apologizing to Roy, moving cattle, and trying to calculate whether he could afford to replace the hay and still make it through winter without borrowing money he didn't have. The answer was no. The answer was almost always no lately. He leaned against the corner of the station building with his hat pulled down and his arms crossed, and watched the train come in and tried to feel something other than the hollow, grinding dread that had been living in his chest for the better part of 2 years. The ranch was failing, not dramatically, not all at once. It was failing the way most things in Montana failed, slowly, incrementally, through a combination of bad weather and bad luck, and the simple, exhausting reality of trying to hold something together alone. He'd had a wife once, briefly, years ago. She'd lasted 8 months before she went back to her family in Ohio, and Wade couldn't honestly blame her. The winters out here were a different species of cold than anything a person raised east of the Mississippi was prepared for. The isolation was real. The work was relentless. It took a specific kind of person to look at this land and decide it was worth it. Wade had always been that kind of person. He'd been born in Wyoming to a father who barely spoke and a mother who died when he was 11, and he'd learned early that the only things you could count on were the things you built with your own hands. He'd come to Montana at 23 with 2 horses, a wagon, and $60, and he'd carved the Mercer Ranch out of the valley by sheer refusal to quit. But he was 34 now, and the refusal was getting harder to maintain. The truth was, he didn't need a wife the way men were supposed to need wives. He wasn't lonely in the way that made you sentimental. He was lonely in the way that made you less efficient. No one to manage the household side of things while he managed the land, no second pair of hands during calving season, no one to notice when the root cellar was getting low before it was actually empty. The ranch was a system, and it was running with a critical component missing. That was what he'd told himself when he wrote to the Matrimonial Bureau. It was a practical decision, a business arrangement. He needed capable help, and he was willing to offer a legal partnership in exchange for it. He'd been careful in his letter. He'd described the ranch accurately in terms of its legal standing and its established operation. He'd mentioned the 4 rooms in the main house, which was technically true if you counted the root cellar access off the kitchen. He'd said the house was sturdy, which was approximately true depending on your definition of sturdy. He described himself as being in good health, which was true. He'd left out the part about the debt. He'd left out the part about the collapsing south wall of the barn. He'd left out the part about last winter, when he'd been snowed in for 11 days straight and had eaten nothing but dried beans and hardtack and had talked to his horses because there was literally no other option. He told himself these omissions were reasonable. A man didn't advertise his worst qualities when he was trying to make a match. He'd present the situation honestly once she arrived. They'd talk. They'd come to a practical understanding. The train came to a stop with a long, gasping release of steam. People began to descend onto the platform. A family with 3 children and too much luggage. A salesman type in a coat that was too thin for October. 2 men who looked like they'd been traveling since last week. And then a woman in a gray traveling dress who stepped down onto the platform and stopped. Actually stopped and stood still, while her eyes moved across the town of Bozeman with an expression Wade recognized immediately and with a sinking sensation in his stomach. It was the expression of someone who had been deeply, catastrophically misled. She was looking at the main street, 2 blocks of wooden storefronts, a saloon, a dry goods store, a smithy, 3 other establishments of no particular distinction, with the fixed, careful blankness of a person trying very hard not to show that they were horrified. She was younger than he'd expected. Her dress had been expensive once. Her hands, when she pulled off one glove to adjust her hat against the wind, were soft and uncalloused and pale, the hands of a woman who had never in her life done manual work. Wade looked at those hands and thought, with absolute clarity, I have made a terrible mistake. He pushed off the wall anyway and walked toward her. Eleanor saw him coming and felt her stomach drop 6 inches. She'd had, she realized, a picture in her head. A picture built from the words of his letter. Serious and reliable character, productive homestead, good health. And from her own desperate need to believe that she was walking towards something better than what she'd left behind. The picture involved a man who was weathered but dignified. Perhaps a little gray at the temples, kind eyes, the sort of rugged competence that looked like it belonged in the illustrations in adventure novels. The man walking toward her was not that man. He was tall. She'd give him that. Broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested actual physical work rather than gentlemanly sport. But his coat was patched at one elbow, and his hat had seen too many seasons, and there was a tension in his jaw that suggested he was not happy about something, or possibly about everything. His face was the face of a man who'd spent years squinting into Montana wind, all deep lines and a mouth set in a way that didn't look like it smiled often. He stopped in front of her and looked at her the way she imagined a rancher looked at livestock before deciding whether to make an offer. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Mercer." She held out her hand. He shook it. His hand was roughly the texture of wood bark. There was a pause in which both of them seemed to be conducting a rapid interior assessment of exactly how bad the situation was. "Train was on time," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "It was." Another pause. "Wagon's out front. I'll get your trunk." He turned and walked toward the station building without waiting for her. Eleanor picked up her smaller bag and followed. And as she did, she took one more look at the town around her. The wind driving dust down the empty street, the gray sky sitting heavy and low over the mountains to the south, the complete and total absence of anything resembling the life she'd had, and she made herself breathe. 4 rooms, she thought, sturdy walls. She followed Wade Mercer to the wagon. The ride to the ranch took 2 hours, and they spent most of it in silence. The kind of silence that wasn't comfortable. The kind that accumulated weight as it stretched, becoming not just the absence of conversation, but a physical presence in the space between 2 people sitting 3 feet apart on a wagon bench with the October wind coming down from the mountains. Eleanor tried, twice, to break it. "How long have you been in Montana?" she asked about 20 minutes in. 11 years, he said. She waited to see if more would follow. It didn't. An hour later, as the wagon crested a low hill and the valley spread out below them, she tried again. "It's very..." She searched for the word, "open." He looked at the valley the way you looked at something you'd stopped really seeing. "Gets more so in winter," he said. "Feels like the sky sits right on top of you." That was the most he had said in 2 hours. Eleanor filed it away as a data point. He was capable of something resembling conversation, but he was going to make her work for it. The ranch came into view around a bend in the frozen creek, and Eleanor kept her face perfectly still. She kept it still because the alternative was to let him see what she was actually feeling, which was a specific flavor of despair she hadn't experienced since the day she'd helped carry the last of her family's good furniture out of the Beacon Street house. The kind that sits in the chest like something swallowed wrong. The main house was small. She'd expected small. Frontier Homestead was never going to mean a Beacon Street townhouse, but she hadn't expected this particular smallness, which was the smallness of something fighting to stay standing. The walls were rough-hewn timber with gaps that someone had tried to fill with mud and straw. One corner of the roof sagged slightly. The front window had a crack running through it. A thin line of smoke came from the chimney, which at least meant there was a fire inside, which was something. The barn was actually larger than the house. 2 corrals beside it, empty now. A woodpile that was not nearly large enough for winter. A small outbuilding that might have been a chicken coop or might have been collapsing. She sat in the wagon and she looked at it and she thought about Harriet's husband's remarks at the dinner table. Then she picked up her bag and climbed down from the wagon before Wade could offer to help her. Inside was worse, and then it was slightly better, and then it was worse again. The floor was packed dirt in the main room, with a braided rug in the center that had been good once, 20 years ago. There was a wood stove, a rough table, 2 chairs that didn't match, a shelf with 3 tin cups and a cracked plate, and a window with no curtain. The kitchen corner had a second, smaller stove, and a collection of pots and pans that had been used hard and cleaned without much affection. A doorway without a door led to what appeared to be the bedroom. Another opening, with a door that had warped in its frame, led to a room that held, as near as Eleanor could tell, winter supplies and something that smelled strongly of earth, the root cellar access, she supposed. So, 4 rooms. Technically. She stood in the middle of the main space with her bag in her hand and her coat still on and tried to remember why she'd thought this was a good idea. Behind her, Wade set her trunk down on the dirt floor. He didn't say anything. She got the sense that he was waiting, for tears maybe, or for the kind of frozen horror that preceded packing up and demanding to be returned to town immediately. Eleanor turned around and looked at him. His expression was carefully neutral. But there was something underneath it. Something she'd recognize later, in retrospect, as a specific kind of shame. The shame of a person who has shown you a lie and is now waiting for you to name it. "I'll need to know where you keep your supplies," she said. "I'd like to start supper." Something moved in his face. Not quite surprise, more like someone receiving news that is better than what they were braced for. "Root cellar," he said. "Potatoes, some dried beans, salt pork. There's flour in the kitchen box." "Thank you." She set her bag on the table, took off her coat, and hung it on the single hook by the door. "I'll figure it out." She went to the kitchen corner and started opening things. What she found, flour, salt, a tin of lard, dried beans that had been in the canister long enough that she wasn't entirely sure of their origins, a half-eaten sack of cornmeal, and a collection of spices in unlabeled tins that she'd have to smell one by one to identify. What she didn't find, any clear memory of having actually cooked a meal from scratch in her life. She thought very hard about the kitchen on Beacon Street, about the way Mrs. Hannigan moved around it, about the specific mechanics of making something edible out of raw ingredients. She thought about the cornbread she'd watched being made 100 times. How much flour? She didn't know. How much lard? She had no idea. She'd never had to know. That was the entire point of Mrs. Hannigan. All right, she thought. All right. She was going to make cornbread. She was going to make it by approximation and confidence, and the simple fact that she had no other option, because returning to Beacon Street, returning to Harriet's sewing room, and her husband's remarks and the shrinking life of a woman who had outlasted her usefulness, was not something Eleanor Whitmore was going to do. She rolled up her sleeves. She found a mixing bowl. She started measuring flour with her hands because there was no measuring cup. From behind her, she heard Wade sit down at the table. Neither of them spoke. Supper that night was, objectively, not good. The cornbread was dense and undersalted and burned on one side where she hadn't turned it fast enough. The beans, which she'd boiled with the salt pork, were edible but had the aggressive blandness of food that had given up. She'd tried to compensate with a handful of dried herbs from one of the unlabeled tins. The herbs turned out to be something she still couldn't identify, and they gave the beans a flavor that was startling in a way that wasn't entirely pleasant. She put the food on the table. She sat down across from Wade. She looked at her plate, then looked at him. He picked up his fork. He ate. Methodically, without expression, one bite followed by the next. He cleaned his plate. He broke off a piece of cornbread and ate that too, in the same steady, joyless way, like a man completing a task that needed to be completed. Eleanor ate half her own portion before she couldn't continue. The The silence at the table was a different kind of silence than the wagon silence. That one had been two strangers avoiding conversation. This one was two people thinking thoughts about each other and the situation and themselves that were too large and too complicated to say out loud, and so the silence just sat there between the plates, getting thicker. Finally, when he'd finished, Wade put his fork down and looked at her across the table. "You haven't cooked much," he said. It wasn't an accusation exactly. It was a statement of observable fact delivered in a voice that was carefully neutral. Eleanor met his eyes. "No," she said, "I haven't." A beat. "Your letter said—" "I know what my letter said." She didn't look away. "What did yours say about the house?" Another beat. Longer. Something shifted in his expression. The neutrality cracked slightly, like ice under a footstep. Just a hairline fracture, but it was there. "Fair enough," he said. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, coming down from the mountains in long, cold sweeps that pressed against the walls of the cabin and found every gap she'd already mentally catalogued. The fire in the stove had died down, and the corners of the room were cold. Through the cracked window, she could see the dark shapes of the mountains against a sky full of more stars than she'd ever seen in her life. "I can learn," she said. "Whatever I don't know. I can learn it." Wade looked at her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. Then he pushed back from the table and picked up his plate. "There's a cot in the back room," he said. "I'll sleep in the barn." "Mr. Mercer, we'll figure out the rest in the morning." He carried the plates to the kitchen corner. "It's late, and I've got an early start." He pulled his coat off the hook. He opened the door. The cold rushed in instantly, filling the room in seconds. He looked back at her from the doorway. "The stove will need more wood in about 2 hours, or it'll go cold overnight. There's kindling in the box by the wall." Then he went out and closed the door behind him. Eleanor sat at the table alone. The fire made small sounds in the stove. The wind pushed against the walls. Outside, somewhere across the dark yard, a horse made a sound in the barn that was almost, not quite, like company. She put her elbows on the table and pressed her hands against her face, and stayed like that for a long moment. Not crying, she was past crying. She'd cried out everything she had on the train 3 nights ago. Just breathing. Just being a person in a room that was cold and bare and nothing like she'd imagined, in a territory that didn't care about her, married to a stranger who was sleeping in a barn to avoid her. Then she stood up. She found the kindling. She fed the stove. She found a blanket on the cot in the back room and wrapped it around herself. She sat back down at the table. She pulled a small notebook out of her bag, the same bag that held her correspondence, her train ticket stub, her 3 hairpins, and her mother's cameo brooch, all the portable remnants of a previous life. And she opened it to a clean page. At the top of the page, she wrote, "Things I need to learn." She started making a list. Dawn came early in Montana, earlier than Eleanor was accustomed to, and with less warning. She was awake before light, not because she'd planned to be, but because the fire had gone cold around 3 in the morning, despite the extra wood she'd added. And the chill that moved into the back room at that hour was the kind of cold that had a personality. It had opinions. It got into her shoulder joints and her feet, and the space between her shoulder blades, and it made itself comfortable and dared her to stay asleep. She lay on the cot under both the blanket and her traveling coat, and looked at the dark ceiling and thought about what she'd written in her notebook. The list had grown longer than she'd expected. She'd spent an hour filling it in, everything she'd observed in the cabin that needed doing, everything she could imagine needing to know, every skill she'd watched other people perform and never bothered to learn herself because she'd never had to. Bread, meat preservation, canning, soap, the wood stove, how to bank it properly, how to cook on top of it without guessing. Animals. She'd written animals and stared at it for a moment and then written a question mark. How to read weather in a place where weather could kill you. It was a long list. It felt like a plan. She got up at gray dawn, stirred the stove back to life, and had a pot of coffee going. That much she knew how to do. Harriet had at least taught her that. By the time the door opened and Wade came in from the barn with frost on the brim of his hat and his hands red from the cold, he stopped when he saw her. She got the impression he'd expected to come back to a cold stove and a woman still in bed. "Coffee's ready," she said. He took his hat off. He hung it on the hook. He sat down at the table. She poured 2 cups and sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the table.
I need you to teach me things, she said, every morning before you go out. Half an hour, an hour. Whatever you can spare, whatever I need to know to not be useless in this place. She looked at him directly. I'm not asking you to be patient. I'm asking you to be honest with me about what needs doing and how to do it. I'll take it from there. He looked at her. You want to learn to cook? He said.
I want to learn everything. Cooking, preserving, the stove, the root cellar, the animals, eventually. Whatever it takes to run this household properly. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. I know what you're thinking. Do you? You're thinking I'll quit, that I'll last 2 weeks and then I'll go back east and you'll have wasted time on someone who couldn't handle it. She met his eyes. I understand why you think that, but I'm asking you to give me the benefit of the doubt until I give you a reason not to. Wade studied her for a long moment. He had a way of looking at a person that felt like he was calculating something. Not rudely, just thoroughly, like a man who'd been disappointed enough times that he'd stopped taking things at face value. You burned the cornbread, he said. Yes. Beans were strange. I know. You don't know what you're doing. No, she said. Not yet. Something in that last word seemed to catch him. Not yet. She watched him turn it over. He drank his coffee. He looked out the cracked window at the lightening sky, at the mountains going from black to dark blue to something that was almost purple as the sun came over the eastern ridge. After chores, he said finally. I'll show you the stove first, then the root cellar. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. He stood up, took his hat off the hook. The stove's got a temper, burns everything first time. He went out. Eleanor sat with her coffee and looked at her notebook lying on the table. Things I need to learn. She picked up her pencil and drew a small line through coffee. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote, Day 1. He was right about the stove. It had a temper in the way that mean dogs had temperament. It wasn't random, it had logic, but the logic was its own, and you had to learn it on its terms. It ran too hot when the wood was too dry, and not hot enough when it wasn't dry enough. And the difference between those two states was not obvious to someone who had never in her life been required to think about wood moisture. There was a particular way to bank it for slow cooking, and a different way for quick heat. And the damper was sensitive in a way that Wade demonstrated twice and Eleanor spent the next hour trying to replicate, burning her knuckle twice on the iron door and getting a faceful of smoke when she got the damper angle wrong. Wade watched her from the other side of the room without comment. This she would come to understand as a teaching style. He showed you once, maybe twice, and then he stood back and let you figure out the rest. He didn't fuss. He didn't hover. If you made a mistake, he'd tell you what you'd done wrong in a single clear sentence and let you try again. It was, she would later think, the most practical and unsentimental way to learn anything, and it suited her better than she would have guessed. By the end of the first morning, she had managed to heat water without incident and had not burned anything. These were small victories. She claimed them both. The root cellar in the afternoon was a different kind of lesson, organizational, methodological, the sort of thing that was actually closer to the accounting work she'd done for her father in the years before the business failed. How much of what, stored where, rotated in what order, tracked against what she'd need to last through a Montana winter. She found a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper and started making an inventory while Wade watched her from the doorway with an expression she couldn't read. What's your winter average? She asked, not looking up from her counting. Weeks of heavy snow when you can't get to town? Bad year. 8 or 10 weeks, he said. Average 4 to 6. She did the math in her head. You're short on flour, and there's not enough salt to get through the meat preservation properly. I know, he said. You'll need to get more before the first hard freeze. I know that too. She looked up at him. He was leaning in the cellar doorway with his arms crossed, and he was looking at her the way he'd looked at her that morning when she'd said not yet, like he was revising something. Sorry, she said. I didn't mean to. You already knew all of this. I did, he said, but nobody said it out loud to me in a long time. She looked at him for a moment. He didn't look away, but he also didn't say anything more. His face was closed in the way of someone who has said something slightly more personal than they intended and isn't sure what to do with that now. I'll write out a full list, she said, going back to her counting. You can tell me what's obtainable before freeze. Fine. She heard him push off the doorway. She heard his boots on the ground above, moving back toward the barn. She crouched in the root cellar, alone with the cold and the smell of earth and the sound of wind above. And she counted out what was there and what wasn't, and tried to make the numbers work. It was the first useful thing she'd done in 2 years. It felt, unexpectedly, like something. The first week was brutal. Not in the dramatic sense. Nothing collapsed. Nobody died. No catastrophe arrived to test them spectacularly. It was brutal in the ordinary, grinding way of too much to learn and too little time, and a body that had never been asked to do any of this and was registering its objections clearly and continuously. Her hands blistered on the third day from hauling water from the creek, because the pump closest to the house had frozen and wouldn't be thawed until Wade could get apart from town. The blisters broke on the fourth day, and the raw skin beneath was a specific kind of agony whenever it hit cold air or water, which was always, because everything out here involved cold air or water. She wore her gloves, but gloves made certain tasks impossible. The fine work of sewing a seal on the window gaps, the precise handling of hot stove iron, the delicate operation of filling the lantern without spilling coal oil everywhere. She did all of it. She didn't mention the hands. Her back hurt. Her feet hurt. She was tired in a way that was different from any tired she'd known. Not the depleted, purposeless exhaustion of sitting in Harriet's sewing room feeling useless, but the deep, bone-level tiredness of physical work, which had its own strange satisfaction underneath the misery. She fell asleep before she finished eating twice in the first week, and woke up both times at the table with her cheek on the grain of the wood, and the lantern low, and the stove needing attention. Wade didn't comment on any of this. He was out before she was awake most mornings, and came in after dark most evenings, and their time in the same room was limited to the morning teaching sessions he'd agreed to. Brief and functional, him showing her something, her practicing it while he went back to work, and the meals they ate together in that not quite comfortable silence. But the silence was changing. It was losing weight. It was becoming less like avoidance and more like the comfortable lack of conversation between two people who have settled into each other's presence without needing to perform. She would work at the kitchen corner while he sat at the table with his account books after supper, and neither of them would speak. And it would be almost fine. Almost. There were still the moments where the reality of the situation pressed in clearly, eating dinner alone while he fixed harness in the barn, or lying on the cot in the back room listening to the wind and thinking about everything she didn't know how to do yet, or the occasional morning when she caught a look from Wade that reminded her that they were still, despite everything, strangers who had lied to each other and were trying to make something work out of the wreckage of those lies. But she was getting better at the stove. The bread on day 8 was dense but not burned. Both halves of it were the same color. She ate a piece standing at the kitchen counter, and it was not objectively good bread. But it was bread, made by her hands from flour and water and lard and a little salt, baked in a temperamental stove in a Montana cabin by a woman who 8 days ago didn't know the first thing about any of it. She thought about writing her notebook entry for the day, and stopped thinking about it when she realized she was smiling. It was on the 9th day that she found the book. She'd been doing a more thorough reorganization of the main room, pulling the rug up to beat the dust out, moving the 2 chairs closer to the stove, looking for places to hang things and finding very few, when she noticed a plank in the wall near the bedroom doorway that sat slightly proud of its neighbors. She pressed on it without thinking, and it flexed. She pressed harder, and it shifted, and behind it, in a hollow space between the wall planks and the outer timber, she found a book wrapped in an oilcloth. She almost didn't open it. It felt private, the kind of thing a person hides because they don't want it seen. But the oilcloth was wrapped in a way that looked like preservation rather than concealment, and the book itself, when she unwrapped it carefully, holding it in both hands, was clearly old. The spine was worn. The cover had the soft, compressed texture of something that had been handled many times. It was poetry. Selected Poems by Walt Whitman. She turned to a page at random and read. She stood there in the cold main room for 10 minutes, reading Walt Whitman, and forgot entirely what she'd been doing. When she heard Wade's boots on the step outside, she closed the book quickly and started to put it back. Then stopped. Thought about it. Left it on the table. He came in and saw it immediately. She watched his face. He went very still. Not embarrassed exactly. It was more controlled than embarrassment. More deliberate. like a man deciding in real time how much something is going to show. I found it in the wall, she said. I wasn't prying. One of the planks was loose. I know the one. He hung up his coat. He looked at the book on the table and then looked away. I like Whitman, she said. A pause. I found that in a mining camp when I was 20. Man left it behind. He went to the kitchen corner and poured water from the pot. Figured he didn't need it anymore. Have you read much poetry? Something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, but she was beginning to learn how to read him. Some, he said. I brought books from Boston, she said. I had to leave most of them, but I kept 3. They're in my trunk. She looked at the Whitman on the table. You can read them if you want. He didn't answer. He drank his water and set the cup down and looked at the table and not directly at her. Then he picked up the Whitman, turned it over once in his hands, and set it back down. What did you bring? He asked. It was a small question, but it was the first question he'd asked her that wasn't about the ranch, or the supplies, or what needed doing. She went to her trunk. She had brought Jane Austen's Persuasion, the Rose Walden, and a battered collection of Emily Dickinson that had belonged to her mother. She brought all 3 to the table and set them down. He looked at them like a man looking at objects from a country he'd heard about but never visited. Have you read any of them? She asked. No. Walden you might like, she said. It's about a man who goes off on his own, lives simply, tries to understand what's essential and what isn't. She thought about it. I think you'd understand it better than I do. He picked up Walden. He looked at the cover for a moment. The Austen is probably not to your taste, she said. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. Almost. I can read it and find out. She looked at him, surprised. He was looking at the Austen with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Curious, a little wary, the way he looked at anything unfamiliar before he decided what to make of it. All right, she said. He set Walden aside and picked up the Austen. Eleanor sat down at the table across from him and picked up the Whitman she'd already been reading, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight while the wind worked its way around the cabin's rough walls and the stove ticked and settled. It was the first evening since she'd arrived that felt like something other than survival. She didn't say that, she just sat and read. But she noticed from the corner of her eye that he turned the first page of Persuasion and kept reading. And he didn't stop. 2 weeks in, she sealed the windows. It was her own project, unasked for and unassigned. She found rags, an old newspaper, and a technique she half remembered from watching someone do it in Boston years ago. Pressing the material into the gaps between frame and wall, layering it, securing it with strips of cloth tacked down with small nails she found in a tin on the workbench. She did every window in the house. She did the gaps around the door frame. She found the largest cold air breach in the back wall of the bedroom and spent 2 hours on it alone. When Wade came in for supper, he stopped in the doorway and stood there. She was at the kitchen stove and she heard him come in, but she didn't turn around immediately. She heard him moving, slowly, around the room. She heard him stop. What did you do? He said. Sealed the drafts. She turned around. The corners especially. There were 5 places where the cold was getting through badly enough that the stove couldn't compensate. He was looking at the window nearest the door. He pressed his hand flat against the wall beside it, testing for air movement. It's warmer in here, he said. By about 5 degrees, I'd estimate. Maybe more in the bedroom. I focused there. He turned around and looked at her. She couldn't quite read it. It was something between surprise and something else. Something she couldn't name yet, something that didn't have a straightforward name. I didn't ask you to do that, he said. I know. She turned back to the stove. Supper's in 10 minutes. He sat down. She heard him behind her let out a long breath, the kind of breath that sounds like something releasing, like something a person has been holding for a while without quite realizing it. She stirred the pot and didn't say anything, but for the first time since she'd arrived, the cabin felt, at least fractionally, like somewhere she belonged. Mat. The first hard frost came in the second week of November. It arrived overnight without announcement, turning the creek banks to iron and pulling the last of the late-season color from the hillsides in the space of a single night. Eleanor woke to a transformed world, white and sharp and absolutely still. the silence of deep cold, the kind that sat on a landscape like something final. She stood in the doorway of the cabin in her coat and looked at it and felt, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, something that was close to awe. Wade came out of the barn and saw her standing there. "First freeze," he said. "Yes." She looked out at the mountains, which were brilliant and enormous and utterly indifferent. "It's beautiful," she said. He stood beside her and looked at the same view. "It's beautiful until it tries to kill you," he said. "Then it's just cold." She almost laughed. She almost laughed for the first time since she'd stepped off the train. She didn't, quite. But something in her chest moved. "I suppose that's true of a lot of things," she said. He looked at her. She was still looking at the mountains. After a moment, he went back to the barn. But she stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the frozen valley come into the light, and thought about the notebook in her pocket and the list she was still adding to, and the bread that had come out right yesterday. Properly right, not just not burned. And the Whitman she'd been reading in the evenings. And the Austin she'd seen Wade carrying to the barn 2 mornings ago, tucked under his arm like he didn't want her to notice. The frontier had not killed her yet. She was going to make sure it didn't. The cold that settled over the Gallatin Valley in November was not like any cold Eleanor had known before. Boston winters were cold, certainly. Cold enough for fur muffs and complaining, and the particular pleasure of coming in from the street and standing near a proper fireplace while someone else brought tea. That kind of cold had texture to it, had personality, had the feeling of something temporary. You endured it in the knowledge that warm rooms and warm people were always nearby. This was different. This cold was indifferent to her in the way that the mountains were indifferent, in the way that the whole enormous sky was indifferent. It didn't care that she existed. It didn't notice her. It moved across the valley every morning with the slow, inevitable weight of something geological. And it sat in the walls of the cabin even after the stove was going full, and it waited in the water bucket every dawn like a personal insult. By the 3rd week of November, Eleanor's hands had stopped blistering and started simply hurting. Not the sharp, specific pain of new injury, but the deep, dull ache of hands that had been worked past their limits and were now recalibrating to a new normal. She rubbed lard into them every night before she slept, the way an older woman in town named Clara Hendricks had told her to do when Eleanor had gone with Wade on a supply run, and Clara had looked at her hands with the frank, assessing gaze of someone who had seen this particular problem many times before. "Lard," Clara had said, not unkindly but without softness either. "Every night. Otherwise the skin splits and then you've got a real problem." Eleanor had bought an extra tin of lard and added it to the list. She had started keeping 2 notebooks now. The first was the original, Things I Need to Learn, which had transformed over 3 weeks from a list of panicked questions into something more like a manual, full of notes and crossed out wrong information and corrected margins where she'd gone back and amended things after learning she'd gotten them wrong the first time. The second was newer, smaller, and she hadn't named it yet. It held observations, details, the specific angle of light on the mountains in the late afternoon, the sound the creek made under ice, the exact expression on Wade's face the morning she'd come out with coffee already made and found him standing in the yard looking at the sky like he was trying to read something in it. She wasn't sure why she was writing that kind of thing down. It didn't seem useful in any practical sense. She did it anyway. The supply run to town had been the first time Eleanor had been back in Bozeman since arriving, and it had been educational in ways she hadn't expected. The town was small. She'd registered that on the day she arrived, with the fresh horror of a woman discovering that what she'd signed up for was significantly less than advertised. But the second time she saw it differently. She saw the way people moved in it, the way the women in particular moved, purposeful, efficient, dressed for function rather than appearance, carrying things, doing things, stopping to exchange information with the practiced economy of people for whom conversation was a resource to be managed rather than a pleasure to be indulged. She watched 2 women outside the dry goods store negotiate a trade of preserved goods with a directness and practicality that would have been considered shockingly rude in any Boston drawing room and was, out here, just Tuesday. Wade had introduced her to a few people. The introductions were brief and slightly awkward in the way of a man who didn't do social niceties with much fluency. "My wife, Eleanor. We're set up out on the South Ranch." The women had looked at her, really looked at her, the kind of assessing look that was less rude than it was simply honest. They were measuring her, working out whether she was going to last. She had shaken hands and said the right things and held herself straight and made sure her hands were in her coat pockets so nobody could see the blisters. Clara Hendricks had been different from the others. She ran the dry goods store alongside her husband, who appeared to be largely decorative. She was somewhere between 50 and ancient, with forearms that suggested she could have wrestled a steer and hands that looked like the geological record of 30 years of frontier work. She'd looked at Eleanor with the same measuring quality as the others, but there'd been something underneath it. Not warmth exactly, more like a specific calibrated interest. "You're the Boston woman," she'd said. "I am," Eleanor had said. "How long have you been here?" 3 weeks. Clara had looked at her for a moment. "You still here," she'd said. "That's something." It wasn't a compliment in any conventional sense, but Eleanor had carried it with her on the ride back to the ranch anyway, turning it over in her coat pocket like a smooth stone. "You still here?" That's something. She was still here. That was apparently, in itself, something. The ride back had been the longest period of time she and Wade had spent in proximity without the buffer of work to do, and it had been not comfortable, exactly, but less uncomfortable than the first wagon ride out from town. They'd been 3 weeks into learning each other's edges, and some of those edges had smoothed slightly, or at least she knew where they were now and could navigate around them. She'd learned that he didn't like being asked questions before he'd had his morning coffee. She'd learned that when he went quiet in the evenings, it wasn't anger, but something closer to exhaustion. Not physical tiredness, but the specific depletion of a person who'd been carrying something heavy for too long. She'd learned that he was meticulous about certain things, the care of his horses, the maintenance of his tools, in a way that suggested these were the anchors of a life that didn't have many. On the ride back, somewhere in the middle of the frozen valley with the mountains purple to the west and the sky going the color of old copper, he'd said, apparently to the road ahead, "Clara Hendricks told me to bring you back to town more often." Eleanor had looked at him. "When did she say that?" "While you were in the store." He kept his eyes on the road. "Said a woman who comes out here from Boston and doesn't run the first month deserves more than a cabin and a root cellar for company." Eleanor thought about this for a moment. "She said all of that?" "Clara says what she thinks," he said. "It's efficient." "I like her," Eleanor said. "Most people do," he said. "Eventually." There was something in the way he said it, the small, dry compression of something almost like humor, that was new. She'd catalogued it carefully. It went in the second notebook. The days developed a rhythm. She hadn't expected that somehow. She'd expected endless chaos, the constant scramble of someone trying to keep up with a life they weren't trained for. And there was some of that. There was plenty of that. But underneath the scrambling, a structure was forming. Dawn meant the stove and the coffee, and Wade's half hour of instruction before he went out. Morning meant the household work, cleaning, organizing, cooking preparations, whatever repair or project she'd put on her list. Afternoon meant the harder learning. She'd started asking Wade to take her into the barn with him when he worked, standing back and watching and asking questions when there was a pause, building up a slow and fragmentary understanding of how the animal side of the operation worked. Evening meant the table and the food and the silence that was becoming its own kind of conversation. She was getting better at the cooking. Not good. She retained no illusions about that, but better. The bread was reliable now. The beans had stopped tasting like an existential mistake. She'd learned to make a serviceable beef stew from the salt pork and the root vegetables, and Wade had cleaned his plate 2 nights running without the expression of a man completing a duty. It wasn't much, but she tracked every small improvement with the focused attention of a person for whom progress was the only available currency. The frontier women noticed. She became aware of this gradually, the way you become aware of a change in weather. Not all at once, but through accumulation. The woman who ran the post in town, a severe-looking person named Mrs. Adler, had been dismissive on Eleanor's first visit and barely civil on her second. On her third, she'd offered Eleanor a tip about storing potatoes without entirely explaining why she was doing it, in the manner of someone performing an act of generosity while maintaining full deniability. Eleanor had said thank you and written it in her notebook, and the next time she was in town, Mrs. Adler had asked how it had worked. It was the beginning of something. Not friendship. Eleanor wasn't naive enough to think that came easily out here, where everyone was too busy surviving to spend much social energy. But acknowledgement. The particular acknowledgement that this community gave to people who were doing the work. There was a woman named Ruth Carey who ran a homestead 2 miles east of Wade's property with her husband and 4 children. And Ruth was the one who finally said what the others had been communicating through their gradual shift in behavior. Eleanor had been in town for supplies, and Ruth had fallen into step beside her on the main street and said, with characteristic directness, "Heard you sealed your cabin walls before the hard freeze." "I did," Eleanor said. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "I worked it out myself, mostly. Trial and error." Ruth had looked at her with an expression that was evaluating and not unkind. "Most women who come out here from back east," she said, "either cry for a month and go home, or cry for 6 months and then go home." Eleanor kept walking. "I haven't cried," she said, which was technically true if you didn't count the train. "No," Ruth said, "you haven't." A pause. "My husband says Wade Mercer hasn't looked this decent fed since before his last—" She stopped herself, started again. "Since a while." Eleanor thought about the last part of that unfinished sentence, but didn't ask about it. She filed it away instead. There was clearly a story about Wade's first wife that existed in this valley's memory, and she was going to learn it eventually, and she wasn't going to learn it by asking the wrong person at the wrong time. "The bread helps," Eleanor said. Ruth looked at her and then laughed, a short, genuine laugh that surprised them both. "Come to me next week," she said. "I'll show you how to do proper preserves before the season's completely gone. You'll thank me in February." Eleanor went the following Tuesday. Ruth's kitchen was a revelation. Not because it was grand, it wasn't. It was smaller than Wade's and considerably more chaotic, with 4 children generating disorder on all sides. But because Ruth moved in it with a complete, unthinking competence that Eleanor found both humbling and instructive. She watched and took mental notes and asked careful questions, and Ruth answered them with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge was a practical good that cost nothing to share and bought goodwill. She came home with 2 jars of preserved apples she'd made herself under Ruth's guidance, hands sticky with sugar, and pride lodged somewhere in her chest like a small, persistent warmth. Wade looked at the jars on the table that evening. "Ruth Carey?" he said. "She taught me the process." Eleanor sat down. "I'll do more when you get the next supply of sugar in." He picked up one of the jars and turned it in his hands, looking at the thick, dark preserves inside. "Put it back down." "Ruth doesn't teach many people," he said. "I know. She told me." He looked at her across the table. She looked back. "Good," he said finally, and picked up his fork. It was 1 word. But she'd learned in 3 weeks how to weigh Wade Mercer's words by the density of what he didn't say alongside them. That one good had weight. She thought about it later, lying on the cot in the dark, and didn't entirely understand why it mattered as much as it seemed to. The hard freeze deepened in December, and the work became more physical than anything Eleanor had yet encountered. Firewood was the constant grinding reality of life, hauling it, splitting it, stacking it, calculating how much was left and how fast they were burning through it, and whether it was going to be enough. Wade handled the splitting, which involved an axe and a technique Eleanor watched with a focus that was partly practical interest and partly simple amazement. He worked with a focused, economical violence that got through wood with very little wasted motion, and she noticed the way his shoulders moved, the way he set his feet, and filed it away in the second notebook, and then caught herself doing so and stopped and thought very carefully about what that meant. She decided it didn't mean anything. She decided this 3 more times over the following week, and it continued to mean nothing each time. She started carrying wood, which was the other half of the equation, not the splitting. That would come later, she told herself, later being the vague horizon on which she placed all the skills she didn't yet have the strength for. But the carrying. Back and forth from the stack to the cabin, arms full of rough-cut timber that scratched through her coat sleeves and left splinters in her palms, and was heavy in the way that real weight is heavy, the kind that accumulates across a day until you feel it in your spine and your shoulders and the backs of your legs. She tracked it in her notebook. Not the second notebook. The first one. Day 34, hauled wood 6 times. Arms functional, back complaining, improving. She did not write it in the second notebook because the second notebook was becoming something she wasn't sure she had a category for. The valley had its own social order, and Eleanor was being slotted into it, slowly, provisionally, with the cautiousness of a community that had been burned before by people who showed up with great intentions and left when things got hard. She heard stories. The family 3 valleys over who'd abandoned their homestead the second winter, leaving everything behind. The woman who'd come out as a mail-order bride the previous year and been back in Ohio by spring. The men who'd come out to strike it rich and ended up bitter and broken because Montana didn't negotiate. What the valley respected, she came to understand, was endurance, not optimism. Optimism was cheap and the frontier had no use for it, not talent or breeding or education or any of the qualities that had mattered in Boston. What mattered here was whether you were still standing after the thing that should have knocked you down. She intended to be standing. The months were marked in increments of accomplishment and difficulty, and December brought both in equal measure. The accomplishments? Her bread improved to the point where Wade ate 2 pieces without being asked. Her preserving was consistent. She'd learned to manage the stove with enough confidence that she stopped burning things and started burning them only occasionally. She'd taken over the full management of the household inventory and had reorganized the root cellar in a way that meant she always knew what was there and what was running low, which meant Wade didn't have to think about it anymore, which meant he had more capacity for the land and the animals. The difficulties? Everything. The cold. The isolation. The days when the wind came down from the north and the temperature dropped past what the thermometer hanging outside the door was built to measure, and you couldn't stand on the porch for more than 30 seconds without your face going numb. The days when she missed Boston so much it was physical, not the Boston of the last 2 years, the diminished Boston of Harriet's sewing room and her husband's remarks, but the earlier Boston, the one of before, the one with books and conversation and the particular sound of a city that was alive with people. She missed being among people who talked about things. She missed theaters and libraries and the smell of a bookshop and the specific comfort of a world built to a human scale. She didn't mention any of this. She wrote some of it in the second notebook, in abbreviated form, late at night when the cabin was cold and Wade's lamp in the barn had gone out. One of those nights, she'd been sitting at the table writing by lantern light. It was past 10. The stove had settled into its slow night rhythm. The cold had come in from the corners of the room in its patient way, when the door opened and Wade came in. She hadn't expected him. She'd thought he was in for the night 2 hours ago. He came in with frost on his coat and stopped when he saw her up. "Couldn't sleep?" he said. "Writing," she said. She closed the notebook without thinking, an automatic gesture, and then felt self-conscious about it and opened it again to look less like she was hiding something. He went to the stove and poured a cup of water from the kettle, the way he did sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep either. She'd started noticing this. The nights when his lamp stayed on in the barn later than usual, or the nights when she heard him moving around after she'd gone to bed. She'd never said anything about it. He stood at the kitchen counter and drank his water and looked at the table. "What do you write?" he said. The question surprised her. He didn't ask questions like that. He asked functional questions, about supplies, about what needed doing, about how a thing had gone. He asked questions that were about information. "Observations," she said. He waited, which she'd learned was his version of a follow-up question. "Things I've noticed," she said. "About the valley, the work." A pause. "Sometimes about you." She hadn't entirely meant to say that last part. He was quiet for a moment. She looked at her notebook and not at him. "What about me?" he said. His voice was careful, not defensive, careful. "How you work," she said. "How you think about the land. The way you can tell what the weather's going to do by the way the air smells." She looked up. "I'm trying to learn things that don't come from instruction, things that come from watching." He looked at her for a moment with that particular stillness of his, the one she'd learned to read as something between concentration and discomfort. "You've been watching me," he said. "I've been watching everything," she said. "It's how I learn." He didn't say anything to that. He finished his water and set the cup down and looked out the dark window at the yard, where nothing was visible. "You're not what I expected," he said. "No," she said. "I don't imagine I am." "Wasn't sure what I expected," he said, in the tone of a man revising something he'd been working on privately for a while. "Not this." "What's this?" she asked. He turned and looked at her. A direct look, the kind he rarely gave, the kind where his face wasn't working to be neutral. Someone who's still here, he said, who's working at it, who doesn't. Stopped, started again. Who doesn't act like it's something to survive until she can leave. The fire made a small sound in the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees on the ridge and made its low, chronic sound, the sound she'd come to associate with winter nights in this valley. It might be something to survive until I can leave, she said. I haven't decided yet. It was honest. She owed him honesty, at least, given everything. He nodded once, in the way of a man who respects a straight answer even when he doesn't like it. He picked up his coat. The south wall of the barn needs checking tomorrow morning, he said. Wind's been finding a gap in it. I could use another pair of hands if you're up early. She looked at him. I'm always up early, she said. I know, he said. He went to the bedroom doorway. He'd moved in from the barn sometime in the second week, a practicality both of them had managed without discussing, and stopped with his back to her. Eleanor. She waited. I'm glad you're still here, he said. Quiet, flat, the way he said most things, like the words were just information. He went into the bedroom. She heard him settle on the far side of the room. She sat at the table for a long time after, not writing, just sitting, listening to the wind and the stove and the specific silence of a place that was, slowly and without her entirely consenting to it, beginning to feel like it might be hers. In the morning, she was up before him. Coffee was made. The south wall of the barn was inspected and sealed by 7 in the morning, the two of them working side by side with boards and cloth and a hammer, their breath making white clouds in the frozen air, not talking much but not needing to. The horses moved in their stalls. The cold was brutal and simple and honest. A hawk turned slow circles in the gray sky above the valley. She handed him nails when he needed them without being asked. He held the board steady while she worked the hammer in the tight corner he couldn't reach. Their hands met once on the rough timber in the exchange of a plank, a brief contact neither of them commented on. The wall held after that. She'd checked it herself, pressing her palm flat against the patched boards, feeling for air that wasn't there anymore. It was one wall, one fixed wall, in one barn, in a territory full of things that needed fixing. It was enough for today. She went back to the cabin and wrote it down, not in the first notebook, but in the second, and this time she didn't stop herself, and she didn't think about what it meant. She just wrote, "The wall holds." I think I might too. December wore on. Christmas came and went without ceremony. She hadn't expected any, and he hadn't offered any, and she'd made a better-than-usual stew, and he'd come in from the barn with a small piece of carved wood that he set on the table without explanation, a rough figure of a horse no bigger than her hand, clearly made by him, clearly labored over in the evenings, while she'd thought he was just doing harness repairs. She held it for a moment and didn't say what she was feeling, because what she was feeling was complicated and not entirely understood, and she was a woman who'd learned in the last 2 months that not every feeling needed to be spoken. "Thank you," she said. He sat down. "Stew smells good," he said. She put the carved horse on the shelf beside the 3 tin cups and served the food, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight while the wind moved over the frozen valley, and it was almost, but not quite, ordinary. It was something that had the shape of ordinary and some of its warmth, something that wasn't quite happiness, but was its nearest available neighbor. January arrived like something personal. The first blizzard of the year came on a Tuesday morning, visible on the horizon an hour before it arrived, a wall of white that moved across the valley with the unhurried certainty of something that didn't need to hurry. Eleanor watched it come from the doorway and felt the specific bodily fear of confronting something that operated completely outside of any scale she'd been built for. "Get inside," Wade said behind her. He was already carrying things, tools, equipment, whatever couldn't be left exposed. "Stoke the stove. Fill every pot and bucket with water before it freezes." She did all of those things. She did them quickly and in the right order, because she'd been here 2.5 months now, and she knew the sequences, the priorities, the logic of how survival worked in this particular place. The blizzard hit at noon and stayed for 2 days. Inside the cabin, they were warm. The sealed walls and the banked stove held against the worst of it, and Eleanor allowed herself a small private satisfaction at that, at the fact that her hours of work with rags and newspaper and determination were now quite concretely keeping them alive. Outside was white, and then whiter, and then a kind of white that erased all reference points, that made the world nothing but weather. They were confined together for 48 hours in 4 rooms, which was a different kind of test from everything that had come before. The first day was manageable. They worked in their separate rhythms. She at her household tasks, he repairing gear that had been accumulating, and in the evenings they sat at the table and she read Dickinson, and he was apparently 50 pages into Walden, and neither of them talked much. This was comfortable in the way their evenings had become comfortable, companionable, in a practical, unsentimental way, 2 people coexisting without friction. The second day was harder. Cabin fever was real, she discovered, and it had a specific quality in small spaces with limited light, with the sound of wind operating continuously in every wall, in the same 4 rooms, and the same 2 people. By mid-afternoon of the second day, both of them were working harder at composure than usual. She was making bread, the 3rd batch in 2 days, because there wasn't much else to do with her hands, and at least the stove was useful. When Wade stood up from the table and said abruptly, "Tell me something about Boston," she stopped mid-need and looked at him. He was standing with his hands in his pockets looking at the wall, which meant he was at approximately the same level of stir-crazy that she was, and was managing it by reaching for conversation as a last resort. "What do you want to know?" she said. "Anything." He turned around. "Something that's not here." She thought about it, hands still in the dough. "In the spring," she said, "when I was young, my father used to take me to the harbor on Sunday mornings. Before church, before anything, just the 2 of us. The ships would be coming in from the night tide, and there'd be fog still, and the whole harbor would smell like salt and fish and tar and things from other places. He'd point at the ships and make up stories about where they'd been." She paused. "He was a very good storyteller. He could convince you of anything." "Where is he now?" Wade asked. "Dead," she said. 4 years ago. The business went with him." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. She went back to the dough. "He was a good man. Terrible businessman." She pressed her palms into the bread and felt the familiar resistance of it pushing back. "He would have thought this was a great adventure." "Do you?" Wade said. "Think it's a great adventure?" She considered the question honestly. "I think it's terrifying and hard and nothing like I thought it would be," she said. "And I think some mornings I wake up and I look at those mountains and I can't breathe from how big they are. In a good way." She glanced up. "That might be an adventure. I'm not sure yet." He sat back down. He was quiet for a moment in a way that felt different from his usual quiet, more thoughtful, more present. "My father didn't tell stories," he said. She waited. "He told you what needed doing and what had gone wrong, and that was the extent of the conversation," he said. "He was a good man. Just didn't see the point in most words." "And yet you read Whitman," she said. Something moved in his face, that almost not quite smile. "I read Whitman," he said, "and now apparently Austen." "How are you finding Austen?" she asked. "Strange," he said. "All those people in those rooms worrying about what other people think of them." "Yes," she said, although she's making fun of it, mostly. "The worrying." "I figured that out by page 10, he said, a little dryly. She laughed. Actually laughed. A short, genuine sound that surprised her almost as much as it appeared to surprise him. He looked at her, and there was something unguarded in his face for just a moment, something open, before he looked back at the table. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the sealed walls and found no way in. The carving she'd found Christmas Day still stood on the shelf. The first notebook was almost full. The second was developing a life of its own that she examined with caution and continued to write in anyway. She punched the bread dough down and let it rest, and thought that she was not, after all, the woman who had stepped off that train. That woman was still somewhere in her, still present in the way the past is always present, but she was being added to, being complicated by, being built up, layer by layer, like the sealed walls of the cabin, something sturdier emerging from what had originally been fragile and ill-prepared. The bread came out right. Both loaves, same color, fully risen, the way bread was supposed to look. She put them on the table while he was reading and didn't say anything about it. He picked one up and tore a piece off without ceremony and ate it and said, still looking at his book, "This is good bread. Not this is better or this is almost right. This is good bread." She turned back to the kitchen and let herself feel it.
The simple, uncomplicated satisfaction of a thing made well, of a skill learned in the gap between what she'd been and what she was becoming. The blizzard broke the next morning. The world outside was clean and white and brutally bright, and the cold that followed a blizzard was the specific cold of air that had been scoured of everything, a raw, new cold that made every breath feel like the first one. Eleanor stood in the doorway and looked at it. Behind her, Wade said, "We lost a fence line in the north pasture. I'll need to get out there this morning." "I'll have food ready when you come back in," she said. She heard him pull on his coat, his boots, the familiar sounds of a man getting ready to go out into a world that was trying to kill things he'd built. She stepped back to let him pass. He stopped beside her in the doorway. He was looking at the same view she was, the blizzard's aftermath, the valley rearranged into something unrecognizable and pristine. "2 days cooped up with me," he said, "and you're still here." She looked at him. "I'm still here," she said. He nodded once and walked out into the snow. She watched him go. The broad shoulders, the coat, the hat, the particular way he moved across ground that was difficult, as if it simply wasn't. And then she turned back into the cabin and went to work. There was bread from yesterday. There was coffee. There was a notebook on the table with pages still empty, and a life still being built out of something that had started as nothing but 2 lies and a train ticket, and a whole lot of land that didn't care whether she made it or not. She had made it this far. She intended to make it further. February in the Gallatin Valley was a different animal from January. January had been brutal in the way of something honest. It hit hard, and it hit directly, and you knew exactly what you were dealing with. February was something else. February was the month that wore you down, not through force, but through duration, through the grinding, repetitive weight of cold that had been going on for too long now, that had stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like a permanent condition of existence. The snowpack was deep enough that moving between the cabin and the barn required a path Wade shoveled out each morning, and Eleanor maintained through the day. And even the horses had taken on the particular stillness of animals conserving energy, standing in their stalls with their heads low, waiting for something to change. Eleanor had been in Montana 4 months. She tracked this not sentimentally but practically. 4 months meant she understood certain things with her body now that she'd only understood with her mind before. She knew how much wood the stove burned in a night at full cold. She knew the difference in the sky between a storm that was coming and a storm that was moving past. She knew which floorboard in the back room creaked and which one didn't, which window let in the most draft despite the ceiling, which corner of the barn the wind hit hardest, and therefore where the animals needed extra bedding. She knew that Wade moved differently in February than he did in other months, quieter, more internal. She'd noticed it building through the last 2 weeks of January, the way his jaw set slightly tighter at the dinner table, the way he looked at the account books he kept in the top drawer of the small desk by the bedroom wall, with a particular expression that wasn't quite worry, but lived in worry's neighborhood. She'd made a point of not asking about it directly, because she'd learned enough about him by now to understand that direct questions about things he wasn't ready to talk about produced nothing but shorter answers and longer silences. What she did instead was clean the desk around the account books one afternoon when he was out, and happened to see the top page of figures and went very still for a moment. The numbers were not good. She had understood, in a general way, that the ranch was struggling. She'd seen it in the depleted root cellar and the patched coat, and the careful way he bought supplies, never more than necessary, always calculating. But seeing it laid out in his careful, angular handwriting made it specific in a way that general understanding didn't. The debt to the Bozeman lending office, the winter expenses against the income from what little he'd been able to sell in autumn, the calculation of what they'd need to buy in spring against what they'd likely be able to earn. She closed the drawer and went back to what she'd been doing and thought about it for 3 days before she brought it up. She brought it up on a Sunday evening, which she'd identified as the best time for conversations he didn't particularly want to have. He was less tired than on weekday evenings. The week's immediate work was not pressing against him, and there was something about Sunday's particular quality of stillness that made him slightly more willing to sit with difficulty. They were at the table after supper. He had the account books out, which meant he'd been going to bring it up himself eventually and just hadn't found the way in. "I want to see the books," she said. He looked up. "All of them," she said. "The full picture. What's owed, what's coming in, what we need to get through to spring,
and what we need to build from there. He held her gaze for a moment. She could see him calculating something, not the finances, but the situation. The question of whether to continue carrying this alone. It's not good, he said. I know, I saw the top page when I was cleaning. He looked at her without expression. Then slowly, he opened the drawer and took out all 3 ledger books and set them on the table. She pulled her chair around to his side and sat beside him, and they went through it together. It took 2 hours. He explained the structure of the debt, which went back 6 years to when he'd had to rebuild the barn after a collapse. He explained the income side, what the cattle operation brought in, and what it could theoretically bring in if the herd grew to a viable size. He explained where the biggest gaps were. He was precise and unsentimental about all of it, the way he was precise and unsentimental about everything, and she listened and asked clarifying questions and made notes in the first notebook, the practical one, and by the end of 2 hours she had a clear picture of where they actually stood. It was bad, but not unsurvivable. That was her assessment. You need the herd to grow, she said. That's the core of it. Everything else is management, but the income problem doesn't get solved without more cattle. I know that, he said, a little tired. What stopped you from expanding before? He was quiet for a moment. I had 1 good year, he said, 3 years back. Spent the money on the south pasture fence instead of cattle. It was the right call at the time. Then the following winter was bad and I lost 4 head. And you haven't been able to build back up? No. She looked at the numbers. Spring calving, she said. How many cows do we have that are likely to produce? 6, maybe 7. And if we can get through this winter without losing any more, that's 6 or 7 more head by May. If, he said. February and March are when we lose them, usually. Cold, illness, difficult births. She nodded, looking at the figures. Then that's what we focus on, getting through February and March. He looked at her from the side, not directly. We, he said. It wasn't a challenge, more like he was testing the word, seeing how it felt. She looked up. We, she said. Yes. He looked at the table. He picked up his pencil and made a small notation in the margin of the ledger, something she couldn't read. Then he gathered the books and put them back in the drawer, and the conversation ended the way practical conversations between them tended to end, not with resolution or conclusion, but with the mutual understanding that the information had been shared and was now something they were both carrying. What changed after that night was subtle but real. He started telling her things he hadn't before, small operational things, which cow was showing signs of difficulty, what the spring planting plan was, what the fence situation looked like in the north pasture. He didn't ask her opinion in any formal way. He just started including her in the information, which she understood to be, for a man like Wade Mercer, a significant gesture. She started doing more outside. It had been a natural progression. The household competence she'd built up over 4 months had created capacity, had given her time and energy that she hadn't had when everything was new and overwhelming. She started going to the barn in the mornings with genuine purpose rather than observation, learning the specific rhythms of the animals, which ones were easy and which ones were difficult. How to tell a cow that was in normal winter sluggishness from one that was developing something that needed watching. The learning had its specific indignities. Animals were not natural to her, and she didn't pretend otherwise. The first time she'd tried to milk a dairy cow without supervision, she'd managed it technically, but it ended up with her stool knocked over and her coat wet and the cow regarding her with what she could only interpret as disdain. She went back the next day and the day after that. By the 4th day, it was functional. By the 2nd week, it was almost easy. Wade watched her progress with the specific evaluation of a man who was recalibrating something in real time. He didn't offer much praise. She'd understood early that he didn't hand out praise as a matter of habit, but she'd learned to read the other signals. The way he incorporated her into the routine without comment, which meant he'd decided her contribution was reliable. The way he sometimes said good at the end of a thing she'd done, flat and plain. The single word carrying the weight of something more expansive that he simply didn't have the language or inclination to elaborate. She'd stopped needing the elaboration. The other thing that changed in February was the evenings. They'd developed a reading habit that had evolved organically from those first few nights when she'd brought out her books, and he'd picked up the Austen with the wariness of a man handling something foreign. He'd finished Walden in January and said about it, "He's right about most things. wrong about how hard it is to be alone. Which was, she thought, possibly the most revealing thing he'd said to her in 4 months. He'd moved on to Persuasion, and she'd watched him work through it with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who didn't read much but read carefully, who didn't move to the next page until he'd gotten what the current one had to offer. One evening in the second week of February, he looked up from the book and said, without particular preamble, "This woman, Anne, she gave up the man she loved because other people told her to." "Yes," Eleanor said, "and she regretted it for 8 years." "Yes?" He looked at the book. "That's a long time to carry that." "Austen thought so too," Eleanor said. "That's the point she's making." He was quiet for a moment. "Did you leave someone behind?" he said. "In Boston." The question was asked carefully, in the tone he used for things he wasn't entirely sure he had the right to ask. She put her own book down and thought about the honest answer. "No," she said. "There was a man once, 2 years before I came here. He decided my family's money was more important than my company and left when the money was gone." She paused. "I was sad for about 6 months, and then I was angry, and then I was neither. It's a long time ago now." He absorbed this. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be. He did me a service in retrospect." Wade looked at her. "How so?" "Because I stopped believing I needed someone else's approval to take up space," she said. "It took losing everything to understand that, but I got there." She looked at her hands, the changed hands, rougher and stronger than the hands that had held that first terrible supper plate 4 months ago. "Although I might have preferred a less dramatic lesson." Something moved in his face. The almost smile. She'd catalogued many variations of it by now. This one was warmer than most. "I had a wife before," he said. She waited. "Her name was Catherine. We were married 2 years. She was from Missouri." He looked at the book in his hands without seeing it. "She was a good person. She just hated it here. The cold, the isolation, the work." He paused. "I couldn't blame her. I tried to, but I couldn't." "How long ago?" Eleanor asked. 7 years. She sat with that for a moment. 7 years of this cabin, these walls, these evenings, alone. 7 years of cold beans and no conversation, and the lamp burning in the barn, because sometimes the barn was better than the empty house. "Is she well?" Eleanor asked. "I believe so. She remarried. She's in Ohio." He closed the book on his thumb, holding his place. "I don't think about it much anymore. I did for a long time." He looked at the fire. "What I think about more is what I should have done differently, whether I could have made it something she could stay for." "Could you have?" Eleanor asked. He thought about this with the seriousness he gave everything. "Maybe," he said finally, "if I'd understood better what she needed. But I was—" He stopped. "I was not good at that, understanding what someone else needed. I was better at the land than I was at people." Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at the fire, his face lit on one side and dark on the other, the book still closed on his thumb. He looked like a man who had been honest about something difficult and was now sitting with the weight of having said it out loud. "You've gotten better," she said, "at understanding what someone needs." He looked at her. "Have I?" "You taught me the stove," she said. "You showed me the root cellar, and the accounts, and the barn. You didn't have to do any of that." She looked at him directly. "You could have just waited for me to fail and then told me to leave." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought about it," he said, "in the first week." "I know you did," she said. "I thought about leaving too." "Why didn't you?" The fire cracked and settled. The wind moved over the valley. That continuous low sound she'd stopped noticing as background and now sometimes stopped to actually hear. The voice of the place she'd written in the second notebook once, and then felt melodramatic about it and then left it there anyway. "Because I decided," she said, "that if I was going to be afraid of something, I was going to be afraid of it while moving toward it, not away." He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight. Then he opened his book and found his page again. But the silence after that was different. It was the silence of two people who had put something down on the table between them and were now sitting with it, neither of them entirely sure what it was, but both of them clear that it was there. She went back to her reading. Her hands had stopped aching in the evenings. She hadn't written that in either notebook. She didn't need to. It was the kind of thing you just knew. It was the kind of thing that meant you were still here. The storm that changed everything arrived on a night in the third week of February. Eleanor heard it coming before she could see it. That was something she'd learned. How to hear the weather before it arrived. The specific register of wind that meant serious business. The way the temperature dropped in the hour before a major storm in a different pattern than ordinary cold. She'd been lying on her side of the bed. They'd arrived at a practical arrangement about this too, in the wordless way they arrived at most practical arrangements, simply by existing in the same space until something settled into place. And she heard the change in the wind at around 10 at night and was awake fully and immediately. She got up and went to the main room window. The sky to the northwest was doing something she'd only seen once before, on the night of the January blizzard. A darkness within darkness, a density in the clouds that meant the storm wasn't coming so much as it was already here and you were already inside it. She went to the stove and started building it up. Wade was up 3 minutes later, which meant he'd heard it too, or felt it in his sleep the way men who'd lived in a place long enough felt things without quite being awake to feel them. He came out pulling on his coat and went straight to the window. "How bad?" she said. "Bad," he said. "Temperature's going to drop hard. I've got to check on the animals. I'll keep the stove up and fill the water." He was already pulling on his boots. He went out and she started filling every pot and bucket and container she could find, because the cold that was coming was the kind that froze the pump and froze the stored water and froze the world into a stillness that lasted until it decided to let go, which it would do on its own schedule and not anyone else's. She worked steadily, the way she'd learned to work in this place. Not fast, but continuous, without wasted motion, task to task in the order that made sense. Fill the water, feed the stove, find the extra blankets and put them at the foot of the bed. Check the supply of wood inside against what the night was likely to require, and bring in 3 more armfuls while she still could, stacking it inside the door with her arms shaking from the cold outside. The storm hit properly at around midnight. It hit the way Montana storms hit, all at once, comprehensively, without any of the gradual buildup that storms in more polite climates observed. The wind went from serious to violent in the space of a few minutes, and the temperature dropped past what the thermometer handled, and the sound of it was the sound of something enormous and completely indifferent pressing against everything they'd built with everything it had. Eleanor was at the stove when she heard it, or rather, she heard what she wasn't hearing, which was the absence of Wade's footsteps crossing back from the barn. She looked at the clock on the shelf, 12:43. He'd gone out at 10:30. She went to the window and looked and saw nothing, because nothing was visible. The storm had taken everything past 10 feet and made it white and formless and without reference. The lantern she'd hung by the door as a guide marker was still burning, but it lit nothing except its own small sphere of existence. She waited 12 more minutes. She counted them. Then she put on her coat. She put on her heaviest gloves. She wrapped a scarf around her face until only her eyes were showing. She picked up the second lantern from the hook on the wall and lit it. She knew he would have told her to stay inside. She knew that clearly and with complete accuracy. She opened the door anyway. The cold hit her like a physical thing, not like temperature, like impact. She bent into the wind and moved along the path toward the barn, which she couldn't see but knew by direction, by the number of steps, by the rope guide she'd noticed Wade stringing between the cabin and the barn back in November, and hadn't fully understood the purpose of until this precise moment. She followed the rope with one gloved hand and the lantern in the other, and the wind took everything else. She found the barn door by falling against it. Inside was immediately different, still cold, brutally cold, but the wind was cut and the noise dropped from overwhelming to manageable, and in the shift of sensory input she could hear the animals, and she could see by the light of her lantern and the one still burning on the post, the inside of the barn. Wade was in the far stall. He was on his knees in the straw beside a cow, one of the dairy cows, the largest one, a 7-year-old animal they'd been watching for 2 weeks because she was late in her pregnancy and running difficult. And the cow was down on her side and the calf was coming, and from the angle of Wade's shoulders and the tension in his whole body, she understood immediately that it was wrong. She crossed the barn at something between a walk and a run. He heard her and looked up, and his face was the face of a man who was frightened and working hard to not show it, which on Wade Mercer looked like extreme focused stillness. "I told you to stay inside," he said. "I know," she said. "What do you need?" "Light,"
he said immediately. Hold it still and don't let it drop. She took a position beside him and held the lantern at the angle he needed and braced her arm against the stall post to keep it steady. What followed was close to an hour. She had no frame of reference for what Wade was doing. The mechanics of it were outside anything she'd observed or learned. But she understood the shape of it, which was a man using everything he knew against a situation that didn't care what he knew. The calf was turned wrong. He worked to correct it with hands that were already cold from 2 hours in the barn, his voice low and continuous, talking to the cow in the tone you used for animals in distress, a low, steady murmur that wasn't words so much as sound. She'd heard him use that tone before in the barn, and it had always struck her as intimate, as something he kept for animals because they couldn't hear the things he didn't say and wouldn't judge him for the things he did. She held the lantern. Her arm ached from the angle within 15 minutes. She shifted her weight without moving the light. The cold in the barn was deep and patient, and sat in her feet first, then her knees, then crept upward through her coat with the methodical persistence of something that had all the time in the world. Her free hand was in her coat pocket, and she moved the fingers periodically to keep feeling in them. The cow made sounds she didn't want to describe. Wade made no sound except the murmur, and occasionally a word to her. Move the light left. Hold it there. Don't move. She didn't move. At some point, she'd stopped tracking time and was operating purely in the present, in the specific reality of the stall and the animal and the light and the cold. Wade said, in a different voice, the controlled voice of a man suppressing something large, "She's not going to make it on her own." "Tell me what to do," Eleanor said. He looked at her. His hands were red and shaking slightly. "Put the lantern down against the post so it holds. Come here." She wedged the lantern against the post at the angle that kept the light where it needed to be and moved to where he directed. "You're going to hold here," he said, positioning her hands. "When I tell you to pull, you pull. Steady, not hard. Steady." "All right," she said. She had never in her life done anything like what she did in the next 15 minutes. She did it without thinking about whether she was capable of it, because thinking about whether she was capable of it was a luxury that didn't exist here in this stall, in this storm, with this animal and this man's hands guiding hers. When he said pull, she pulled. When he said hold, she held. When he said now, a single word, sharp and clear, cutting through the sound of the storm outside and the animal and everything. She understood what it meant, and she did it. The calf came free. It came free with a rush and a sound, and Wade caught it, and it landed in the straw, and Eleanor sat back on her heels in the mess and the steam and the specific animal reality of birth, and she looked at the small, wet, entirely motionless creature and felt a terror that was completely new. "Is it?" she started. Wade was already moving. He had the calf, and he was clearing its airways with practiced, urgent hands, and then the calf moved. A small contraction, a reflex, a leg jerking against the straw. And then it moved more, and the sound it made was small and definitive and alive. Eleanor put her hand over her mouth. The cow lifted her head and turned toward the sound. Wade sat back in the straw and put his hands on his knees and breathed. Just breathed. Deep and uneven, the breathing of a man letting something go that he'd been holding very tight. Eleanor realized her hands were shaking. She looked at them, her strange, changed hands, rough and red from the cold, covered in things she wasn't going to think about. And they were shaking with a fine, continuous tremor that was partly the cold and partly something that didn't have a physiological explanation. "Here," Wade said. He took both her hands in both of his and held them, not gently exactly, firmly, the way he did everything. His warm, rough palms pressed against her cold ones. He held them until the shaking in her fingers slowed and then stopped. She felt his warmth moving into her hands like something transferred. She felt her fingers come back to themselves, joint by joint. She looked at their hands, and then she looked at him. He was already looking at her. His face was... She didn't have a word for it. Open wasn't right, because his face was never open. He kept too much internal for open to apply. But something in it was present in a way it usually wasn't. Something that had put down its usual armor just for this moment, in this barn, with the storm outside and the calf in the straw and the steam rising from the cow's breath and the lantern making everything amber and shadow. "You stayed," he said. You needed the light, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, still holding her hands. Then he looked down at them, as if noticing what he was doing. He didn't let go. I've lost animals before, he said. In a storm like this, I've lost animals and I've lost a... He stopped, started differently. I thought this one was going to go the same way. But it didn't, she said. No, he said. It didn't. The calf was trying to stand now, doing the specific, uncoordinated, earnest work of a newborn finding its legs for the first time. It got halfway up and sat back down and tried again. The cow was on her feet and watching it with the focused attention of a new mother deciding whether everything was all right. Eleanor watched the calf try to stand and felt something in her chest that was too large and too complicated to examine right now. In a cold barn in the middle of a blizzard 4 months into a life she'd arrived at through desperation and dishonesty, and the specific grace of not having anywhere better to go. Wade let go of her hands. He stood and checked the cow, the calf, the stall. His hands moved with the quick, sure efficiency she'd watched all winter, the competence of a man who'd been doing this alone for so long that it had become automatic. She stood too, and her legs ached from the kneeling, and her back ached from the cold, and she was dirty and exhausted, and she'd never felt less like the woman who had stepped off that train in Bozeman. She'd also never, she realized, felt more like herself. Whatever that self was now. Can we get it to morning? She said. The cow, the calf. I'll stay, he said. I'll stay with you. He looked at her. I'm not going back to the cabin, she said simply. You stayed in this barn all winter. I can stay one night. He looked at her for a long moment with that unreadable expression. Then he turned and got the extra wool blanket he kept on the tack wall hook. She'd seen it there, but never known why until now. And he handed it to her without a word. She wrapped it around her shoulders and sat down in the straw with her back against the stall post, near enough to the lantern to have its warmth, and he sat down beside her. Not far, closer than he usually sat, close enough that his shoulder was against hers. Outside, the storm did what it did. The wind worked at the barn walls and didn't find enough purchase to matter. Inside, the cow breathed. The calf sorted out its legs, piece by piece, with the patient determination of something that had only been alive for 30 minutes and already understood it needed to keep trying. Eleanor's shoulder was against Wade's shoulder, and she was exhausted down to her bones. And after a while, her head tipped, just slightly, against him. Not a decision, just gravity. And he didn't move away. They sat like that in the straw while the blizzard made its argument outside, and the lantern burned steadily, and the calf, eventually, stood. Not perfectly. It stood the way new things stand, uncertain and ungainly, and slightly ridiculous, and completely, stubbornly alive, Wade said quietly, to the barn, and not to her in particular. There it is. There it is, she said. She didn't move her head. He didn't move his shoulder. Outside, the storm began, very slightly, to ease. She was still awake when the first gray of pre-dawn came through the gap in the barn boards, turning everything from amber to colorless. The calf was nursing. The cow was standing steady. Wade had fallen asleep at some point in the last hour, his breathing slow and deep, his shoulder still solid against hers. Eleanor looked at this calf and the cow and the cold morning light coming through the gaps, and thought about what had been true before last night and what was true now, and whether those were the same things or different things. She decided they were different. She didn't write it in either notebook. Some things were too large for the second notebook, which had always been the book for small things. The hawk, the light on the mountains, the way his face moved when he wasn't watching himself. What had happened in this barn in this storm was not a small thing. She sat with it instead, in the straw, in the cold morning, with her shoulder against his. She sat with it and let it be true. Wade woke in the barn straw at first light with a stiff neck and Eleanor's shoulder no longer against his. He lay still for a moment before opening his eyes. Outside, the storm had dropped to something manageable. He could hear it in the changed quality of the wind, the difference between a blizzard still at full force and one that had burned through the worst of itself. Inside the barn, the animals were quiet. The lantern had burned down to almost nothing. Eleanor was standing at the stall gate with her back to him, watching the calf nurse. She'd kept the blanket around her shoulders, and her hair had come loose from its pins sometime in the night. She was holding her right hand, the one that had taken the worst of the cold, cupped in the other,
and she was very still in the way of someone who had been standing there long enough to stop fidgeting. He watched her for a moment without speaking. In 7 years of running this ranch alone, the barn at dawn had been a particular kind of solitary, not unbearable. He'd made a certain peace with solitary before Eleanor arrived, but defined, the way all solitude is defined, by what isn't there. The stillness of a space built for more than it was holding. This morning was different, and he let himself know it without immediately deciding what to do about it. "How's she doing?" he said. Eleanor didn't turn, but her shoulders shifted slightly. "Good, I think. The calf is feeding. She seems less distressed than she was." A pause. "I don't actually know what stable looks like for a cow after a night like that." "That's stable," he said. He got up from the straw, which took more effort at 34 than it had at 24, and checked the cow himself. The calf was nursing with the single-minded urgency of something that had been alive 8 hours and had already decided that survival was worth working for. He ran his hands along the cow's flank, and she turned her head and looked at him, and what he read there was acceptable. "She'll be all right," he said. He heard Eleanor let out a breath. "Go inside," he said. "Get warm. I'll finish up here." She didn't argue. She handed him back the blanket and walked to the barn door and stopped. "Wade." He looked up. She was standing with her hand on the door, looking at him with an expression that was direct and also careful. The way she looked at things she was still working out. "I'm glad I was here," she said. "Last night, that's all." It was a simple sentence, arrived at through the wreckage of more complicated ones, and he understood that the simple one was the true one. "I know," he said. She nodded and walked out into the gray February morning. He watched through the gap in the barn boards until the cabin door closed behind her. Then he stood in the barn for a moment with his hands at his sides, not doing anything, just standing. Then he went back to work. Spring arrived the way Montana springs arrived, not gently, but with the aggressive energy of a season that understood it had limited time. The snow pulled back from the valley in stages through March and April, and the ground that came up underneath was dark and raw, and smelled like something returning to itself after a long absence. Eleanor walked the property in early March and tried to see it the way Wade saw it. The south pasture, the north field he planned to expand, the creek running high with snowmelt along the eastern fence line. She'd stopped being frightened of the mountains sometime in December. They were simply there now, the way the stove was simply there, the way Wade was simply there, large and permanent and requiring a specific kind of navigation rather than fear. 6 calves arrived in March, staggered over 3 weeks. 2 of the births were difficult enough that she and Wade worked them together, and by now they were an established team in a way that didn't require conversation to function. She knew when he needed light, when he needed another pair of hands, when to stay back and when to come forward. He stopped having to tell her and started simply working alongside her, which was more efficient and also something more than efficiency. It was in this same March that Wade told her about the cooperative. He said it at supper, not as a question, but as a report, which she'd learned to recognize as his way of including her in decisions that were already made, but that he wanted her to understand. Thomas Carey, the Carey's eldest boy, was coming to work the ranch through spring and summer, 15 years old, reliable, worth the cost. "Ruth says he's good," Eleanor said. "He is," Wade said. He turned his fork over in his hand, the gesture she'd come to recognize as the physical equivalent of organizing thoughts. "I want to put in a new fence line along the east pasture before the ground fully thaws. More grazing area means we carry more cattle through next winter without feed eating us alive." She'd been thinking about the same problem from a different direction. "The accounts have room if you're careful about the timber purchase," she said. "Use the repair budget. Don't open a new credit line." He looked at her. "You've been in the books." "We agreed I would be," she said. "We did." A pause. "You're right about the timber." She was right about the timber because she'd spent an afternoon in late February going through the ledgers with a pencil and the first notebook open beside her, working the numbers the way her father had taught her, without optimism, accounting for what was likely to go wrong as well as right. She'd left her notes in the margin for Wade to find. "I'm going to town Tuesday," she said. "I want to talk to Clara Hendricks about cooperative buying, timber and seed. If we're not the only ones purchasing, we might get better prices." He looked at her with the evaluating expression that had softened over the months, but was still fundamentally the expression of a man who didn't take things at face value. Then it shifted into something else, something she'd cataloged as specific to the moments when she said something that surprised him in a direction he hadn't expected. "That's not a bad idea," he said. "I know," she said, and he almost smiled. She went to town Tuesday, taking the wagon alone for the first time, something she'd been working toward for weeks, practicing in shorter distances until she was confident enough to trust herself with the full 4-hour round trip. Wade had watched her hitch the horse that morning without comment. When she climbed up and picked up the reins and looked at him, he gave her a single nod. That was the whole send-off, and it was enough. Clara Hendricks was doing inventory when Eleanor came in, and looked up with the expression of a woman who already knew this visit had a purpose. They talked for 2 hours. By the time Eleanor left, 3 ranches in the valley had agreed to pool their spring timber and seed purchases, with Clara coordinating. The savings would be modest but real, 10 to 12%, Clara estimated, and on the scale of a struggling ranch, 12% was not nothing. It was a heifer. It was a season's worth of fence repair. It was the difference between a number in the red and a number in the black. Eleanor drove home in the late afternoon with the mountains going pink to the west and thought about what she'd just done. She'd walked into a room and negotiated something and walked out with a result. She'd been good at this kind of thing once, in her father's business, before that life ended. She'd spent 2 years believing the competence had ended with the life. It hadn't. It had just been waiting for somewhere useful to put itself. When she pulled into the yard, Wade was coming out of the barn. He watched her bring the wagon in and unhitch the horse, movements that were practiced and confident, and nothing like the fumbling uncertainty of her first weeks. And when she turned around, he was looking at her with the unguarded version of his face, the one that forgot to perform neutrality. "Clara Hendricks is putting together cooperative buying," she said. 3 ranches, timber and seed, will save 8 to 12%. "You did that in one afternoon," he said. "Shh, Clara did the heavy lifting. I provided the idea and the momentum." "That's usually the harder part," he said. She looked at him. He was looking back. The afternoon light was long and flat across the yard, and the mountains were doing their evening thing, going from gold to purple, and there was nothing cinematic about any of it. Her arms were tired from the drive, there was mud on her boots, the horses needed feeding, but she felt the specific weight of the moment anyway. The way 2 people sometimes see each other clearly at the same time, without either of them meaning to. "Go inside," he said. "It's cold." She went inside. Thomas Carey arrived the first Monday of April, and revealed himself within an hour to be exactly what his mother had promised. Reliable, unpretentious, and capable of seeing what needed doing without being told. Wade assessed him the way he assessed everything, silently and thoroughly, and by the end of the first day had clearly decided Thomas was worth his wages. Eleanor's relationship with Thomas was different from her relationships with the valley's adults. He had no previous version of her to compare against. He arrived into the ranch as it currently existed and accepted it as normal, which meant he arrived into a situation where the rancher's wife handled accounts, drove wagons alone to town, and could deliver a calf in a storm. And he took all of this as simply how things were. One afternoon in late April, he was in the kitchen doorway after the midday meal, the way he sometimes was, watching Eleanor take bread out of the oven. "My ma said you couldn't cook when you first came," he said. "Your mother was correct," Eleanor said. "She said you learned it all here." "I did." He thought about this with the seriousness of a young person working out something real. "So you had to become a different person," he said. She looked at the bread, the clean brown crust, the even rise, bread that had taken 100 attempts to become this casually reliable. "I had to become more of the same person," she said. The parts that were already there just expanded to fill the available space. Thomas looked like he wasn't sure what that meant. She wasn't entirely sure either, but it felt accurate. "That's a lot of space," he said, looking out the window at the valley. "Yes," she said, "it is." The spring moved into summer and the work changed character. Less survival, more construction. Wade and Thomas put in the east fence line through April, and Eleanor tracked the progress against the budget she'd laid out. She started a kitchen garden in May. The herd grew with the spring calves, and with 2 purchases Wade was able to make in April, the purchases funded partly by what the cooperative buying had saved. Ruth Carey came in June, ostensibly to return a preserving jar, actually to see what was happening at the Mercer place.
Eleanor recognized this with the clarity of someone who had been paying attention to this valley's social mechanics for 8 months. Ruth didn't make unnecessary trips. She sat at the table with coffee and looked around the cabin with the frank inventory of someone who had been here before and was taking account of differences. There were differences. The rug was new, made over the winter from worn-out clothing, larger and better anchored than the one it replaced. The window had curtains, sewn imperfectly but functioning. The shelf held books and preserved goods, and the carved horse, and the accumulation of objects that gave a room the quality of being inhabited rather than merely occupied. Ruth turned her coffee cup in her hands. "You're different," she said. "I should hope so," Eleanor said. "I mean from last October, when you got off that train." She drank her coffee. "Adler told me about it. Said you had silk gloves and the face of a woman who had just made a terrible mistake." "She wasn't wrong," Eleanor said. "And now?" Eleanor looked out the window at the June Valley, green and wide, the mountains in their permanent positions, Thomas visible as a small figure in the north field, the sound of Wade's hammer somewhere beyond the barn. "Now I'm here," she said. Ruth nodded, as if Eleanor had confirmed something already worked out. "My husband said last week that Mercer's place looks more like a going concern than it has in years." Eleanor thought about the account books, the calves, the seed purchased at 12% less than last year, the fence line that was already earning its keep. "We've had a good spring," she said. "You've had a good winter," Ruth said. "Good spring is just the payoff." After Ruth left, Eleanor stood in the middle of the main room and looked at it. Same cabin, same walls, same roof that still needed attention on the east side, but different in the way that mattered, in the quality of a place that had been argued into life rather than simply endured. One evening in August, they were on the porch after supper, a habit that had developed in the warm months. The valley was going through its evening colors, the mountains moving from gold to purple to the dark blue that preceded night. Wade was quiet beside her, which was normal, which meant he was thinking rather than absent. "My father would have liked you," he said, to the mountains rather than to her. She looked at him. He didn't look back. He didn't like many people, he said, but people who worked without needing to be told, who figured things out, he respected that. He paused. "He would have said you were useful." "That's the highest compliment," she said. "From him it was." She looked back at the valley. "I'd like to think he'd look at all this and think you'd done all right." Wade was quiet for a moment. "I think he'd say we'd done all right," he said. She looked at him. He was still looking at the mountains. "Yes," she said. "We." The words sat between them in the August evening, plain and solid and sufficient. Not a new word. They'd been using it for months. But she heard it differently tonight, with the weight of everything that had accumulated behind it. A winter. A birth in a freezing barn. The accounts spread on the table between them. A shelf that leaned slightly left. A valley that had watched and made up its mind. She reached over and put her hand on top of his where it rested on the porch rail. He turned his hand over and held hers. Not a declaration, not a resolution. Just two people sitting in the growing dark with the valley going quiet around them and the year's work behind them and more work ahead, and the specific, unadorned truth that what they had built together was worth the building. She didn't write it in either notebook that night. Some things were too large for the second notebook, which had always been the book for small things. The hawk, the light on the mountains, the way his face moved when he wasn't watching himself. What had been built this year was not a small thing. She let it stand without annotation, the way the shelf stood, imperfect, functional, made with genuine care. That was enough. That was more than enough. The second winter was not easier than the first. It was different, which was not the same thing. Eleanor knew the stove now. She knew the root cellar and the rhythm of the cold and the logic of the work. The fear that had lived in her chest through that first October. The specific terror of a woman operating far beyond the edges of her competence was largely gone. But the cold was the same cold. February came back with the same gray relentlessness, and the moments when the temperature dropped past what the thermometer handled, those moments were not improved by familiarity. You just met them differently. You met them as someone who had been through it once and come out the other side, which was a different stance than terror, but was not the same as comfort. What changed was the quality of the work itself. The first year, everything had required conscious effort.
Each task demanded her full attention because she was still learning the task. The second year, the task became background, became the structure of the days rather than the content of them. And inside that structure, there was room for something else. Room to think ahead. Room to notice things beyond immediate survival. She used that room to look at the ranch clearly. The account books told a story that was improving but incomplete. The herd was growing. The cooperative buying arrangement she'd set up through Clara Hendricks had saved them real money in that first spring and continued to do so. It had expanded to 5 ranches by the second year without much effort on anyone's part, simply because a working idea attracted people who needed it. The debt to the Bozeman lending office was smaller than it had been. But smaller was not gone, and gone was the only number that meant the ranch was truly theirs. She told Wade this on a January evening, the 2nd January, sitting across from him at the table with the ledgers open between them. "We need 2 more good years," she said. "Maybe 3 if we have another bad winter." "I know the numbers," he said. "I want to make sure we're building towards something specific," she said. "Not just surviving towards something vague." He looked at her. "What's the difference? Surviving towards something vague means you stop when it gets hard enough. Building towards something specific means you know what you're working for and you don't stop until you get there." She met his eyes. "I want to know we're doing the second thing." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the January wind moved over the valley with its patient, permanent weight. "We're doing the second thing," he said. "Then say the number," she said. "What does done look like?" He looked at the ledger. He said a number. The debt? Cleared. A herd size. A fence line completed. Specific, concrete. The language of a man who thought in terms of what existed rather than what was hoped for. She wrote it in the first notebook. "All right," she said. "Then that's what we're working toward." The third year brought the hardest test that had nothing to do with weather. A man named Garrett came through the valley in April, representing a land acquisition company out of Helena that was buying up smaller ranches and consolidating them into larger grazing operations. He was well-dressed and reasonable-sounding, and he made Wade an offer that was, on its surface, not unreasonable. Enough to clear the debt and have money left over. Enough to start somewhere easier. Wade didn't tell Eleanor about the visit until 2 days after it happened. He told her at supper, in the flat tone he used for things he'd already decided but felt she had a right to know. "A man came by Tuesday," he said, "offered to buy the ranch." She set her fork down. "I told him no," Wade said. "You told him no without talking to me first," she said. He looked at her. "It was my answer to give." "It's our ranch," she said. "That makes it our answer." The silence that followed was the kind they hadn't had in over a year. The heavy kind. The kind with weight. She looked at him across the table, and he looked back, and neither of them looked away. "You're right," he said finally. It cost him something to say it. She could see that. "I should have told you before I answered." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She picked up her fork. "But for what it's worth, my answer would have been the same." He looked at her. "You didn't even hear the number." "It doesn't matter what the number was," she said. "This is not something we built to sell." Something in his face shifted. That specific movement she'd cataloged over 2 years. The one that happened when she said something he hadn't expected and hadn't known he needed to hear. He looked at the table. "No," he said. "It's not." Garrett came back a month later with a higher number. Eleanor was in the yard when he rode in, and she was the one who walked out to meet him, and she told him clearly and without hostility that the ranch was not for sale and would not be for sale, and that he was welcome to save himself the ride in the future. He looked at her with the mild condescension of a man who has underestimated a woman before and is in the process of doing it again. And then he looked at her more carefully, and then he left. Wade had watched from the barn doorway. When Garrett's horse was out of sight, he walked over to where she was standing. "You didn't need to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He stood beside her, and they both looked at the road where the rider had gone, and the valley beyond it, and the mountains beyond that. The May grass was coming up in the lower pasture, green and new, and the creek was running full and clear, and the north fence line that Thomas had helped put in was holding exactly as it should. "It's a good ranch," she said. "It is," he said. "We made it that way." "Yes," he said. "We did." The debt cleared in the 4th year. Wade came home from town on a gray March afternoon and set a receipt on the table without a word. Eleanor picked it up and read it and put it back down and looked at him. "Now what?" she said. He almost smiled. "Now we build the north barn," he said, "the one I've been putting off." She opened the first notebook to a fresh page. "Tell me what you need," she said. "Materials, time, hands." He started talking. She wrote it down. This was what they were. Not the dramatic version, not the story version, but the actual version. Two people who, when the significant moment had passed, picked up the pencil and made the list. Because that was how things got built. Not through feeling alone, but through the daily decision to keep going. One evening that same spring, late, after Thomas had gone home and the house was quiet, Wade stopped in the bedroom doorway the way he sometimes did when he had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. "Eleanor." She looked up from the notebook. "I wrote to the matrimonial bureau because I needed a practical solution," he said. "I described a ranch that was better than what I had. I left out the parts that would have sent you somewhere else." He looked at the doorframe. "You know that." "I know," she said. "My letter wasn't honest either." "No," he said, "but here's what I've been thinking." He looked at her directly, committing to it. "The reason I wrote and the reason you answered, those were bad reasons, desperate reasons. Neither of us was being straight with the other." He paused. "But what we built from those reasons is something I would have chosen. If I'd known what it was going to be, I would have chosen you. Not a capable woman, you specifically." The room was quiet around them. The lamp between them made his face warm and shadowed and entirely itself. No performance, no management, just a man saying a true thing in plain language. "I know," she said. "I would have chosen you too." She looked at him. "Although I would have asked better questions about the house." He was quiet for one beat. Then he laughed. A real one, surprised out of him, and it changed his face into something younger and entirely undefended. She laughed too, and it filled the kitchen, and he crossed the room and she leaned into him and he put his arms around her and they stood like that in the quiet house while Montana did what Montana always did. When enormous and cold and indifferent outside, full of stars, not caring about the small warm light in the window of one ranch in one valley. The indifference was not cruelty. She had understood this by now. The land didn't care whether you made it. That was exactly why making it meant something. Years later, and there were many years, real years that accumulated with the weight of things built and kept, the Mercer Ranch became one of the most recognizable operations in the Gallatin Valley. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, but consistent, capable, the kind of place that other ranchers pointed at when they needed an example of something that worked. A going concern, as Ruth Carey's husband had said in that first spring, and he said it again 10 years later with a different kind of weight behind it. Eleanor kept every notebook. The first one, 2 volumes by the time she was done adding to it, became a practical document that Thomas Carey's wife consulted seriously when they started their own homestead. The second notebook, the one for observations, for small precise things, she filled 7 times over the years. She never showed it to anyone. She learned to ride properly in the 3rd year, after admitting that functional but not good was no longer sufficient for her own standards. She learned from the best rider in the valley, a woman who had no patience for false modesty, and she became competent rather than excellent, and she crossed it off the first notebook's list and didn't feel the need to put anything in its place. Some things she never crossed off. The deep knowledge of a place that only came from time, the valley's specific weather logic, the social architecture of a community that looked simple and wasn't. These were not tasks to complete. They were ongoing, and she stopped treating them as problems to be solved and started treating them as the texture of a life being lived. In the fall of their 10th year, a young woman pulled a wagon into the yard on an October afternoon. She was perhaps 24, dark-haired, dressed wrong for the climate, shoes too thin, coat too light. She stood in the yard and looked at the valley and the mountains with an expression Eleanor recognized in her body before her mind caught up with it. She pulled off her gardening gloves and walked over. The young woman's name was Alice Pearson. She'd come in on the train that morning, headed to a homestead 12 miles east, and the people in town had sent her here. "They said you'd know what to tell someone who was new," she said. Eleanor looked at her for a moment, at the wrong shoes and the good eyes and the specific quality of someone who was frightened and not planning to let the frightened part win.
Come inside, Eleanor said. I'll put coffee on.
They sat at the table, the same table marked by 10 years of use, and Eleanor told her the truth. Not the comfortable version, the actual version. It's going to be harder than you think, she said. Even if you've prepared yourself for hard, it will be harder than that. Alice was very still. The land doesn't negotiate, Eleanor said. It doesn't care about your intentions or your effort or what you left behind to get here. It only cares what you do when you're here. She looked at her hands wrapped around the coffee cup, the Montana hands, calloused and capable, and nothing like the hands that had stepped off the train 10 years ago. And that turns out to be clarifying. Were you frightened? Alice asked. When you came? Every day for months, Eleanor said. Does it stop? The frightened part mostly stops. The part where things go wrong in ways you couldn't predict. That doesn't stop. You just stop being frightened of being frightened. She looked at Alice directly. You find out that fear is not the thing that determines what happens. What you do with it is. Alice looked at the bookshelf against the wall. The crooked one, the one that had never been fixed, and at the notebooks on the desk, and the carved horse on the shelf, and the room that had the quality of a place built up slowly by people who meant it. How did you learn everything you needed to know? She asked. I made a list, Eleanor said. I started at the top. I didn't skip the hard things. She paused. And I had someone who taught me without making me feel like a fool for needing to be taught. That part mattered more than I expected. Wade came in for the midday meal while Alice was still there and sat down and ate and said the minimum, which was him, which was normal. Alice watched him the way new people watched Wade, trying to take his measure, uncertain what to make of the quiet. Eleanor had done the same thing once at the same table 10 years ago. When Alice left, with a list of practical advice, a jar of preserved apple, and the names of every woman in the valley worth knowing, Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched the wagon go. Wade came up behind her. She'll be all right, he said. I think so, Eleanor said. She has good eyes. He stood beside her for a moment, both of them looking at the road where the wagon had gone. The October Valley was doing its October thing, the light going low and golden, the mountains already carrying their first new snow above the tree line, the whole enormous landscape settling into itself before winter. Same time of year you came, he said. 10 years ago tomorrow, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Do you ever think about it? The train? The first night? Sometimes, she said. I burned the cornbread. You burned everything, he said. I did, she agreed, and you ate it without saying a word. It seemed like the right thing to do, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the valley with the expression she knew best, the one that wasn't performing anything, that was simply a man looking at the place he'd chosen and finding it sufficient. Finding it, after everything, enough. She thought about the woman on the train with the soft hands and the letter full of lies, and the specific desperation of someone who had run out of options and was calling it a choice. That woman was still in her somewhere, still present the way the past is always present, but she had been so thoroughly added to, so completely built upon, that she was more foundation than person now. That was what this place had done, not fixed her, not transformed her into something unrecognizable, just kept asking things of her until she found out she had them to give. I'm glad I came, she said. I know, he said. I'm glad you ate the cornbread. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was terrible, he said. It was, she said. I got better. You did, he said, at that and everything else. They stood in the doorway of the cabin that was nothing like what either of them had advertised and everything they had, and the valley held its breath before the first hard cold, the way it did every year, the way it would go on doing long after they were gone. She reached over and took his hand. He held it. That was the whole of it. That was the truth that had been hidden inside the lie. Not a grand revelation, not a dramatic arrival at happiness, but this. Two people standing in a doorway they'd built together, holding on, looking at a world that didn't care whether they made it. They had made it anyway. That was enough. That had always been enough. Sonnet 4.6